Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Daily Easy English Talk. I'm Emma.
And I'm Jack. Thanks for joining us.
Today, we're digging into some source material covering a really intense period in Los Angeles just recently.
That's right. We've got reports and notes focusing on events mainly from Friday, June 6, 2025, through to Monday, June 9th.
Yeah, quite a weekend. The material covers these significant immigration protests that happen, this very unusual deployment of federal troops, and some really, really strong reactions from leaders at all levels, local, state, and federal.
And our mission here really is to walk you through this information. We want to pull out the key events, look at the different perspectives presented in these sources.
Exactly. And maybe uncover some surprising details about how everything unfolded. The sources definitely paint a picture of things escalating quite quickly over those few days.
Think of us as guides, helping you navigate what the reports say happened, who the key players were, based strictly on the material we have in front of us. We'll try to lay out the timeline and the different angles.
Okay, let's jump right in then. According to the sources, things really started, heating up on Friday, June 6th. Downtown LA seems to be the focus initially. What kicked things off?
Well, the report suggests the initial trigger, the spark if you like, was a series of federal immigration arrests.
ICE raids.
Yes, immigration and customs enforcement. The sources state that over the week leading up to that Friday, ICE operations had resulted in over 100 arrests in the LA area alone related to immigration status.
Right, over 100 arrests. And that seems to be what initially brought people out protesting. But it didn't stop there, did it? Things got much bigger over the weekend.
Oh, yeah. By Sunday, June 8th, it was the third day, and the scale had really ramped up. The reports talk about thousands of people taken to the streets.
And what fueled that escalation, according to the sources? Was it just the arrests?
Well, the ongoing immigration crackdown was certainly a major factor, but the report specifically mentioned another key element that Sunday: the arrival of federal troops. National Guard.
Federal troops arriving in LA. Was that something the city or state asked for?
No, and that's a really crucial point we'll definitely need to circle back to. The sources mentioned about 300 National Guard troops arriving that Sunday.
And how did that go down?
The reports explicitly state this arrival spurred anger and fear among some residents. So it seems it added, fuel to the fire, really.
Okay, so you got these growing protests, thousands of people, and now federal troops on the scene, adding this whole other layer of tension. And the sources describe some pretty intense actions happening within the protests themselves.
They do. The material details some specific actions attributed to certain protesters. Blocking a major freeway, for instance, the 101.
Blocking the 101, that's significant.
Very. And then there's this detail about vehicles being set on fire. Specifically, the sources mentioned at least 4 self-driving Waymo cars.
Waymo cars, the robot taxis?
Exactly. Set ablaze. The reports even describe smoke billowing and the cars intermittently exploding as they burned. That's quite a vivid image.
Exploding. Wow, that sounds like pure chaos.
It certainly points to some serious destruction in specific spots. The sources also talk about objects being thrown at law enforcement officers.
What kind of objects?
The reports list things like concrete, rocks, even electric scooters, and fireworks being thrown. Some people were apparently doing this from behind makeshift barricades they'd set up.
And were there specific incidents mentioned that led directly to arrests?
Yes, the reports highlight a couple. One person arrested on Sunday, allegedly for throwing a Molotov cocktail, a firebomb, at police.
A Molotov cocktail?
Yeah. And another person was arrested for ramming a motorcycle into a line of officers. So specific acts of violence like that are mentioned as leading to arrests.
And these protests, they weren't just confined to downtown LA, were they?
No, that's right. While Sunday's main focus seemed to be several blocks downtown, the sources say that on Saturday, protests had also spread south into places like Paramount and nearby Compton.
It's probably important, though, to keep the scale in context. The sources do compare this to other major events in LA's history, don't they?
Yes, they do. And that's a really useful piece of context from the material. The reports state that while these were definitely significant protests, they didn't reach the sheer size or scope of things like the Watts riots back in the 60s or the Rodney King riots in 92 or even the large Black Lives Matter protests in 2020.
Okay, so protests escalating, some violent incidents spreading geographically, but maybe not as massive as some past events. How did the authorities on the ground, like the police, respond? What do the sources say?
The material details the tactics law enforcement used. Things like tear gas to disperse crowds, rubber bullets, flash bangs, those loud grenade-like devices, and other crowd control munitions, primarily to clear areas, like getting people off the freeway.
And there was some kind of formal declaration made, too.
Yes, the reports mention that the police declared an unlawful assembly in the affected downtown areas.
What does that mean, exactly?
The sources explain it's basically a formal warning. It tells people they have to leave the area, and it's usually the step taken right before officers start making arrests if people don't disperse.
And did they make arrests? The sources mention numbers.
They do. Reports say several dozen people were arrested over the whole weekend. For Sunday specifically, in LA, the number given is 27 arrests related to the protest activity.
The sources also noted something about the media covering the events.
Yeah, unfortunately that's in there too. Members of the press weren't immune. A camera operator for the BBC, the British broadcaster,
Right.
and also Lauren Tomasi, who's a reporter for Australia's Nine Network, were both reported as being hit by rubber bullets while they were doing their jobs covering the protests on Sunday.
That's concerning. Now, the sources also give us perspectives from local leaders trying to manage this. What about the LAPD chief, Jim McDonnell? What's his take, according to the reports?
Chief McDonnell is quoted, and he seems to be directly pushing back on some claims reportedly coming from the Trump administration.
Like what?
Well, he stated very clearly, according to the sources, that LAPD was not given any advance notice about those ICE raids that happened on Friday.
So they weren't prepared.
That's his point. They weren't notified beforehand, so they couldn't prepare, but they responded as quickly as possible once things started happening. He called the violence he saw disgusting and noted how it seemed to escalate from Friday onwards.
Did he say how his department was coping?
He's quoted saying the LAPD felt overwhelmed, specifically regarding the number of people out there engaged in this type of activity, meaning the violence.
And did he distinguish between different groups of people out there?
Yes, the sources mention that. He expressed his belief that the individuals involved in the violence and destruction were, in his view, distinct from the people who were there to peacefully protest immigration policies and exercise their First Amendment rights.
Okay. What about the LA County level? The sources quote Hilda Solis, a county supervisor.
Right, Supervisor Solis. She described Sunday night as potentially one of the most volatile nights the city had experienced. But she also noted that by Monday morning, things had calmed down quite a bit, although some roads were still closed.
Did she comment on resources?
She mentioned, according to the reports, that the LA County Sheriff has the authority to call on local police departments within the county for reinforcements if needed, sort of implying there are existing protocols for mutual aid.
And we also heard about Paramount, south of LA, where protests happened Saturday. The mayor there is quoted.
Yes, Mayor John Moreno of Paramount. He said his town was calm again by Sunday night and Monday, but he expressed some concern, specifically about the National Guard presence.
Why?
He felt, according to the sources, that having federal troops, especially in a smaller place like Paramount, could promote fear and uncertainty among residents. He did stress support for peaceful protest, but also made it clear that vandalism and property destruction wouldn't be tolerated and would be handled by the sheriff's department.
Okay, so we have the local responses, the police actions, but let's get back to that really big point of contention you mentioned earlier, the National Guard deployment itself.
Yes, this is really central to the whole story presented in these sources. It's described as quite extraordinary. President Trump authorized the deployment of the National Guard to Los Angeles. But crucially, without any request from California's governor, Gavin Newsom, and without his consent.
So the governor didn't ask for them?
No. The sources say about 300 troops arrived Sunday, though President Trump later said he'd actually authorized up to 2,000 Guard members, and that 500 U.S. Marines were also sort of on standby, ready to deploy if needed.
Wow. And the sources give some historical context for this. How unusual is it?
Extremely unusual based on these reports. They highlight this seems to be the first time in decades, maybe since the 1960s, that a president has activated and deployed a state's National Guard within that state without the governor asking for it or agreeing to it.
Who was the last time?
The example given in the sources is 1965. President Lyndon B. Johnson federalized the Alabama National Guard to protect civil rights marchers going from Selma to Montgomery against the wishes of the Alabama governor at the time.
Okay, so very rare. What was the Trump administration's reason, their justification, for doing this in LA in 2025?
According to the reports, President Trump cited a legal provision. It apparently allows the president to use federal forces in cases of, quote, A rebellion or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States.
Rebellion.
That's the term used in the provision he reportedly invoked. He's quoted saying he was dealing with violent people in L.A. and declared they're not going to get away with it.
And the White House backed this up.
Yes. The sources quote a White House spokesperson, Abigail Jackson. She strongly refuted Governor Newsom's position, calling it a bald-faced lie for Newsom to claim there was no problem in Los Angeles before President Trump got involved.
Right.
She defended the president's actions as necessary.
And Trump himself commented further.
He did. On Monday, he posted on social media, according to the reports. He claimed he stopped L.A. from being completely obliterated and suggested Governor Newsom and L.A. Mayor Karen Bass should be thanking him.
Thanking him. But the reaction from California officials, especially Newsom and Bass, was, well, the opposite of thankful, right?
Absolutely explosive. The sources are filled with their strong opposition. Governor Newsom is quoted calling the deployment a serious breach of state sovereignty.
Strong words.
And he didn't stop there. He called it illegal, immoral, and unconstitutional, and even an unmistakable step toward authoritarianism. He publicly demanded Trump remove the troops.
Did he say California couldn't handle it?
Quite the opposite. He insisted California authorities had the situation under control and didn't need or want this federal intervention. He also directly challenged Trump's version of events.
How so?
The reports say Newsom publicly mocked Trump's social media post, and he specifically addressed a phone call they reportedly had on Friday. Newsom stated, quoted on MSNBC, "I believe that Trump never mentioned deploying the Guard in that call." He called Trump a stone-cold liar about it.
A stone-cold liar? Wow.
Yes. And the sources also report that California was planning to sue the federal government over the deployment, possibly filing as early as that Monday. Newsom argued the executive order Trump used was so broad it could potentially be applied to any state, not just California.
And what about the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass?
Mayor Bass also strongly condemned the federal action. The sources quote her saying the federal response was completely unnecessary, and in her view, it actually made things worse. It escalated the tensions.
So she blames the administration.
Directly. She's quoted saying the chaos was provoked by the administration. She said it wasn't really about public safety, but about another agenda. She specifically pointed back to those icy raids on Friday.
How did she connect the raids to the later chaos?
She called the raids the fuel for a fire that was unnecessary, asserting that L.A. was peaceful before those federal actions began that week.
So it's really stark, isn't it? Based on these sources, you have the federal government saying, we stepped in to prevent disaster, and the state and local leaders saying, your actions caused the disaster.
Exactly. A complete breakdown in agreement, playing out very publicly. The reports really highlight that deep division between D.C. and California officials on what happened and why.
And the intense language, the rhetoric, didn't stop with just the troop deployment. It got even more personal, especially regarding Governor Newsom on Monday.
Yes, this was another significant development reported in the sources. On Monday, President Trump was asked about the situation, and he made a comment about his border czar, Tom Homan.
What did he say?
He said he thought it would be a great thing if Tom Homan arrested Governor Newsom. He even added, "I would do it if I were Tom. I think it's great." And then he called Newsom grossly incompetent.
He said Homan should arrest Newsom, a sitting governor.
That's what the sources report Trump said.
How did Tom Homan himself respond to being pulled into this idea of arresting the governor?
Well, the sources report Homan addressing it. Initially, he's quoted making a more general statement, something like, "Nobody is above the law, and if Governor Newsom or Mayor Bass cross the line to commit a crime, then yes, they could potentially be arrested," talking broadly about consequences for illegal actions.
Okay, speaking generally.
But then the sources also quote Homan trying to clarify those remarks later, apparently on Fox News. He explicitly said there was no discussion about arresting Newsom in his earlier comments. He maintained, he was just speaking generally, that anyone who crosses the line, obstructs ICE, destroys property, impedes law enforcement, would face consequences under the Trump administration.
So a clarification trying to walk it back a bit. But how did Governor Newsom react to Trump's original comment suggesting his arrest?
Predictably, very strongly. The sources show Newsom took to social media, platform X. He posted, and I quote from the reports, "The President of the United States just called for the arrest of a sitting governor."
He framed it directly like that.
Yes. He called it a day I hoped I would never see in America and said, "I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican. This is a line we cannot cross as a nation. This is an unmistakable step toward authoritarianism." He also added a defiant note, basically daring Homan to try it, saying Homan knew where to find him.
And Mayor Bass. Did she react to Homan's initial broader comment about potentially arresting officials?
The sources say Mayor Bass responded by saying she personally wasn't worried about being arrested because she wouldn't interfere with federal agents, but she did call Homan's initial comment inappropriate.
It's striking how extreme the language became. Based on these reports, we're talking about the highest levels of government.
Absolutely. The sources really capture a moment where terms like unconstitutional, authoritarianism, and even the public suggestion of arresting a governor were being thrown around in relation to these events. It shows how incredibly charged the whole situation was.
Okay, stepping back a little from the main clashes and the political rhetoric, the sources also mention some related developments happening around the same time. These add a bit more context, right?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
One significant item reported is the arrest of a major union leader, David Huerta.
Who is who?
He's the president of SEIU California, the Service Employees International Union, a very prominent figure in California labor. The sources say federal agents arrested him.
On what grounds?
The allegation reported is that he tried to obstruct federal agents' access at a worksite. He was charged with conspiracy to impede an officer, which the sources note is a felony charge.
And what was his status?
At the time the reports were filed, he was apparently in federal custody, waiting for a bond hearing.
Did his arrest lead to more protests?
It did. The sources mentioned specific protests organized in support of Huerta. Labor leaders rallied outside the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. They were reportedly chanting "Free David," holding signs, and some Democratic lawmakers joined that rally too.
We also get a perspective from a member of Congress representing part of the affected LA area.
Yes, Congresswoman Linda Sanchez. The sources quote her linking the civil unrest directly back to President Trump's immigration policies. She called it a cruel and broken immigration system, stating that ICE raids tear families apart and erode community trust. She basically argued ICE presence doesn't make neighborhoods safer.
And there was also an action taken by one of the cities near LA, Glendale.
That's right. The reports mentioned the city of Glendale decided to end its contract with the Department of Homeland Security.
What was the contract for?
It allowed DHS to house ICE detainees, people picked up in immigration enforcement, at the Glendale City Police Facility.
And why did they end it?
The city manager put out a statement, cited in the sources, saying the contract had become divisive in the community. The decision, they said, was based on public safety, local accountability, and building trust. The statement also explicitly noted that while some might see it as political, the decision itself wasn't driven by politics.
Interesting. Finally, the sources bring up something that often comes up during protests, like this idea of outside agitators.
Yes, that narrative is mentioned. The reports include the perspective of some law enforcement analysts. Their view, as presented, is that people they term professional rioters or agitators were likely mixed into the crowds in LA.
What's the implication of that?
The idea presented is that these individuals weren't necessarily there for the core immigration protest, but were actively looking for confrontation, maybe responsible for a lot of the violence and property destruction.
But the sources also provide some critical context or counterpoint to that narrative, don't they?
They do. They bring in analysis from experts, naming sociologist Alden Morris, and also citing reporting from CNN's Kyung Law. They discuss the history of the term outside agitator.
What's the history?
The experts point out, according to the sources, that this term has often been used throughout history, sometimes as a deliberate tactic to discredit protest movements, to sort of dismiss the legitimacy of the grievances.
How does it do that?
Well, the sources suggest it can distract from the actual root causes of the protest, ignore real connections between different activist groups, sometimes be used to justify using force against protesters, and maybe even discourage others from joining the movement.
So it's a loaded term.
Potentially, yes. The sources also quote CNN analyst John Miller, suggesting the crowd was probably a mixed genuine immigration demonstrators, maybe some anti-government protesters, and possibly anarchist groups too. It presents both the claim about agitators and the critical analysis of using that kind of language.
Right. So this deep dive into the source material on LA, it's covered a lot.
It really has. We've traced the events from those initial protests over immigration arrests through the escalation with the unexpected arrival of federal troops, the clashes that followed, the arrests, and then this huge political battle erupting between federal, state, and local leaders.
And we touched on related things too, like the union leader's arrest, Glendale's decision on the ICE contract, and how different sides frame the events, like with the outside agitator idea.
It really underscores how complex these situations are, doesn't it? You see actions on the street directly influencing and being influenced by decisions and rhetoric at the very highest levels of government.
Yeah, and it really brings out the different ways you can look at everything. What motivated the protesters? How appropriate was the law enforcement response? Where does the authority lie, federal or state? What's the impact of that kind of heated political language? How do we even interpret violence when it happens within a larger protest?
Exactly. So many layers.
So here's something to really chew on. Thinking about everything these sources presented, given that big clash over the National Guard, who do these reports suggest really holds the reins when it comes to public safety and managing unrest inside a state? Is it the state itself, or can the federal government just step in like this?
And maybe related to that, how does the kind of extreme language we saw reported here, calling for arrests of governors, talk of authoritarianism, how does that affect the basic ability of different levels of government to even talk to each other, let alone cooperate when things get tough? What stands out most to you as you process all this information from the sources?
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive today.
We really hope going through these sources on the recent events in Los Angeles has given you a clearer picture of the key facts as reported, the very different reactions, and some of the underlying tensions that this material brought to light.
We always encourage you to keep exploring, keep digging into the information on topics that matter to you. Look for those key insights yourself.
So don't forget to subscribe to Daily Easy English Talk so you don't miss our next show.
Yeah, please do, and share it with your friends if you found it helpful.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Bye-bye.